Alright everyone, welcome back to Dan's Astrology. Today, it's Friday, October the 4th, and I don't know if you can tell by the lighting, but it's a dark and gloomy, rainy October day. We just recently had a solar eclipse in Libra, as well as a Mercury cazimi in Libra, and now Mercury is in this post-cazimi phase. And what cazimi is Mercury crossing paths with the sun. This time around it happened in direct motion, meaning that Mercury transitioned from being a morning star into an evening star. So it's kind of like a coming of age story for Mercury. A youthful Mercury becomes a older and wiser Mercury out of some kind of initiatory experience. And what's interesting is that it's said to be that when Mercury's in the heart of the sun, it's getting a boost, it's getting recharged, it's getting a new kind of energy. But when it's once it's past that point, or there's within 15 degrees of the sun, Mercury is not visible. Any planet within 15 degrees of the sun is considered to be combust, right? And so there's some sort of thing around this where the Mercury itself is sort of obscured by the light of the sun, and it could be like there's something that I noticed anyways was that during this time between now and my last video, I tried recording a video that I decided not to post. I was not very happy with how it turned out, and to be honest, it's not the first time this has happened. In my creative process of recording these videos, I don't do a lot of edits, but I also don't post everything that I record, and I think there's something about the Mercury cazimi phase of this kind of like Mercury is not very clear because it's obscured by the light of the sun, basically, right? And at the same time, what we've got going on is a grand water trine, which is very maybe appropriate because it's a very wet and rainy day right now. And I have to also admit there's a lot of stuff going on in the news that I think has the power to affect you at this like emotional level of just seeing, because I remember there's the war in the Middle East with Israel. There's the floods of North Carolina, and there's something about just like seeing the images of these floods that I think just has this direct emotional, like you can't see the whole whole areas like that being flooded without being affected by it some way, right? And I think there's something going on with the grand water trine that's happening right now that there's this tendency to get affected at this emotional level. And there's something about the way that the emotions work is that the emotions are not always entirely conscious. That there's a lot of stuff that, or the way we tend are, well, by having a conversation about something, by making a video like this, I can choose specific things to focus my attention on and to bring to light, right? But there's all this stuff that naturally we don't talk about for various reasons, and the things that we don't talk about get in. There's this kind of thing where I think there's a certain kind of there's a certain style of like whether or not you believe in the Jungian unconscious or not, that some people criticize this idea of the Jungian unconscious. I mean, that's a bit complicated, but I think in a very basic sense that you can look at anything has the power to be either made conscious or unconscious by deliberately paying attention to it, deliberately investigating it, there's all sorts of things which are under the surface which we can go and dig up and bring out and say, look at this, and have a closer look at, and then put it back underneath the subconscious, right? And there's something about this which is it lends itself, unfortunately, to a kind of like manipulative subliminal marketing that if you think about, if you've ever seen that documentary Century of the Self, one of the earlier Adam Curtis documentaries, they talked about this guy Edward Bernays, who was actually related to Sigmund Freud. I think he was like his nephew or something. And there's all this thing about how the invention of PR and about like managing image and public relations, or basically kind of engineering certain things by rather than playing to a rational argument, playing to people's emotional affects. And one of these examples was there's the women's suffragette movement, or women who want to be have the right to vote or have the same rights as men. And there was a deliberate strategy to market cigarettes to women that if women were smoking, it showed that they were, they had the same rights as men. They were defiant, or that they had, they weren't just going to be confined to this sort of image of what ladylike behavior was. And of course, back then they didn't maybe understand that how dangerous cigarettes were or whatever, right? But there's this kind of thing of like using, playing off of an emotional appeal that or creating this sort of thing that's not really rational, but that plays on this level that has more to do with images or feelings than like a direct rational thing. And there's this whole kind of problem with, I think, I don't know, there's something about what I was running into some kind of problem in what I'm drawn to make video blogs about, or whatever I'm drawn to write about, or something like that, is that there's I have some sort of compulsion to try to talk about something that isn't being talked about otherwise, because for me there's sort of there's all this stuff that isn't being talked about, and for me this is like an opportunity to have something to say, right? But then at the same time there's this sort of there's a tendency to by if that's the direction I'm going at, that there's all this stuff that isn't being talked about, that is under the surface, that I want to get into, that there's this problem with that. Basically, in the sense, I'll talk about it this way, that there's something that I learned when I was dealing with people who I was when I'm recording this video, I have a video recorder that's recording, and I'm just coming up with some idea that I'm just putting out there for mass consumption, right? And I don't know who's on the other side of this. I don't know what the other, so I have to kind of create an idea in my mind of a certain audience, or of a certain perspective, of a certain point, but unless I'm actually talking to somebody that's actually really there, I'm just sort of I'm creating my own sort of unconscious projection of what my audience is supposed to be, and it's like have you heard of this thing about shadow boxing, right? You're like a boxer who's having an imaginary boxing fight with somebody who isn't there, right? And it's sort of that, you can do this, but at some point in time it feels like you're just fighting yourself, or that. And I think this goes directly in. There's certain things that came up around my last video, and one of these things has to do with Friedrich Nietzsche. And one of the things about Friedrich Nietzsche, there's a channel that I discovered recently that I am, whatever. I don't want to be too much of a fanboy. I've only gotten into this channel recently, but this channel, Essential Salts, that makes great content about Nietzsche and other philosophers. And I'm just crediting where I got this idea from. There's this idea that I think it was like Jung said this about Nietzsche actually, but I got this from Essential Salts that there's like Friedrich Nietzsche had this quality of trying to tell people a truth they didn't want to hear. And Jung kind of had this attitude that if you're trying to tell somebody a truth that they don't want to hear, it's better to, be quiet and wait until somebody is listening to you, rather than just as you sense people aren't listening to you, you just get louder and you get angrier and you get more if you're not listening to me, I'm just gonna scream at you. I'm just I'm gonna beat my fist against I'm just gonna make a whole bunch of noise and just like freak the fuck out until you listen to me, right? And I think there's something about this sense of this transits we're dealing with here is that we just had this Mercury Cazimi where Mercury is now an older, wiser Mercury in this square to Mars. So there's obviously a potential for some kind of, angry or emotional kind of, volatile communication. And then with the grand water trine happening, there's this problem with Saturn and Neptune, where the Saturn and Neptune in Pisces to me feels just like coming up against a hard wall, right? And this idea that there's you have this whole abundance of water, the 3 water signs are fully loaded. There's this whole, and you're feeling I want to communicate some stuff because I've got this overabundance of water that is filling up because of this. It's kind of like the dam, right? Like the hydroelectric dam, the reservoir, this over flooding thing. And you're I just want to take some of the stuff that's in my emotional reservoir and then take it into something that I can communicate, and into something where I'm not just relegated. I'm not just over flooded with this emotional stuff that's in the shadows. But the problem about Saturn and Neptune and Pisces is that I feel like it's you're talking to a wall. You're talking this whole point. If there's somebody who's fully committed to just not listening to what it is you have to say, they've made up their mind that you don't have anything worthwhile to offer them whatsoever, and they're not listening. You can yell, you can scream, you can throw a temper tantrum, you can cry, you can do whatever you want, but they're not going to listen to you. They don't give a shit. Or they have either that, or they are kind of they just don't have the capacity to deal with it. They have a hard limit. They're not going to go there. They're not going to talk about it. They're not going to address any of this stuff. And so, but you're left where does all this? My water is fucking overboiling. It's overflowing. What the fuck am I? I need something. I need to do something with this, right? I need to do something, or else, you don't want to just have a rupture, right? You don't want to just have the balloon is bursting now. The balloon is exploding because there's no way to actually put this into a productive conversation or something like this, right? But there's something about this with another side of Friedrich Nietzsche. First of all, this thing about you sense somebody isn't listening to you, so you're just going to get louder and angrier and crank up the volume until they can hear you. But that's maybe not the best idea, right? It's maybe better to be quiet and just wait until you have a chance where somebody's listening to then express your thing, right? There's another part of this, specifically to do with Nietzsche too, is that recently I felt like making some kind of a video where I was defensive, basically. This feeling a need to defend myself or defend my interest in certain things that I'm reading, right? Defending, because for a long time, 10 years ago, I bought a Nietzsche book and I didn't read it. And I was going through some mental health stuff, and I was you know what, maybe just diving into Nietzsche isn't good for my mind. Maybe there are more wholesome or bit more constructive things to get into, and I ended up getting to a lot more kind of like Alan Watts stuff, or like different kind of like meditation practices. And I just like, you know what, I'll just put Nietzsche on the back burner. Don't have to deal with him. Not any real priority to get into Nietzsche. And the thing is, like, when I started getting into Nietzsche, I saw this, like, somebody post I saw somebody on my friends list post something about Bertrand Russell making a criticism of Nietzsche for being like a, like a misogynist, for being a person who's obsessed with power, but he had no power in his own life. And this is all stuff that, like, as somebody, I was familiar with all these criticisms before ever even flipping open a Nietzsche book. There's a certain thing, like, you don't even have to read any Nietzsche to be familiar with these criticisms of him and these associations with him. And there's certain things of, like, feeling this need to be like, to record a video and be like, to basically say that, the reason why I'm getting into Nietzsche is not because I'm interested in Nietzsche because he was a misogynist, right? That's not what I'm not getting interested in Nietzsche because Nietzsche, ideas were used by the Nazis, right? And there's this other thing is too that, like, I have this other book that I haven't started reading, which is this one, the Heidegger Being in Time. And, like, Heidegger was a Nazi, but I've been reading other writers talk about Heidegger's ideas, and it's just sort of like, maybe just inconvenient that this guy who was a card-carrying member of the Nazi party, etc., he's, that he has some sort of philosophy that's worth, like, there's a certain thing that, like, who am I making this video for, basically, right? Like, I'm trying to imagine my audience, right? I'm trying to, and if my audience is people that are all any remotely familiar with this stuff, they are going to be people who, if I have to make a video saying, hey, I'm reading Heidegger and I'm not a Nazi, I'm wasting my breath, because, like, there's a lot, like, for a lot of people out there, that's not really an issue, right? Or that by feeling the need to defend myself but there's a certain point in this that the philosophers themselves, or the material, has its own shadow, right? That is independent from me getting involved in it or not, right? And this is what I'm trying to say about the Mercury being burnt out by being too close to the sun right now in this square to Mars, and this grand water trine. And the way that, like, especially with, Venus in Scorpio is ruling over Libra, where Mercury is, where the eclipse just happened. And Venus, from the position of Scorpio, Venus does not see Libra. Libra is like a kind of a blind spot to Scorpio, right? And so there's this whole thing going on where I don't know. Maybe this is also not a very good video, but I'm like going into all this. There's other ideas that I had about this, which is also maybe even relating some of this Nietzschean stuff, is that there's this whole idea about, like, ressentiment, right? The idea of, like, there's a certain kind of Nietzschean attitude about not pitying people, right? Not taking pity on, I'm not going to pull out my Nietzsche books today or anything like that, but there's this sort of, like, you see it in modern attitudes, right? One of the things that happened recently, just a few days ago, David Lynch dropped a series of interviews, and it seems like he'd been working on this project for a while, because there's quite a number of these interviews. I'll link that in my notes and references. But in one of these interviews, I just noticed, like, very casually, it's just like these ideas or attitudes that populate the minds of just ordinary people, right? And I don't know who's ordinary anyways, right? But it's like the kind of attitude that, like, if you've had things happen to you in the past, or you've had some sort of difficulty or adverse circumstances, this idea that you don't get hung up on the difficulty, you don't get hung up on the adverse circumstances, you just gotta be strong and carry on and do all, and, don't look back in the past, you gotta, and there's this kind of thing that's like, it's like this common common wisdom, right? It's a common attitude. But at the same time, one of the things that happened recently here in Canada is the Truth and Reconciliation Day, which I realize is a much more divisive issue than I would have anticipated. One of these things that I find, like, I live with my family who are all pretty much identified as, like, left wingers, more or less, right? Generally, my whole family has always been generally on the left, and my whole family has always been, trying to be friendly and understanding of, like, Indigenous people and sympathetic to those kinds of things. And I just have to say that, like, it's just kind of weird. Sometimes when I'm hanging out online, I just, like, don't. It's surprising. Like, I would assume more people would be more understanding of this, but there's this whole attitude of people who are, I don't know, like, there's this whole culture war, basically, right? And anything that's progressive, anything that's, like, trying to, whatever, right? Like, admit that there's some problems with settler colonialism or whatever, that with residential schools. Like, for some reason, there's a lot of people that are really, like, uptight about accepting this, right? And the thing is, if people weren't uptight about accepting this, there wouldn't be any point in doing this Truth and Reconciliation Day in the first place, right? But there's something about, like, during the time that Truth and Reconciliation Day was happening. I mean, I do admit that I didn't really post anything on Facebook about it. I didn't really feel like I had anything to contribute to that conversation at that time. But there's what I kind of felt, though. Like, I was doing some journaling. And what I felt was that, like, you internalize stuff that's going on outside, and there's some kind of, like, and I think maybe I made all these posts, and I made this stuff not about that stuff, but something that is more personal to me, my own kinds of. I had this experience of going under involuntary hospitalization due to mental health things when I was younger, and I was just admittedly reacting to all this stuff in the news where people are calling for more involuntary treatment and all this kind of stuff. And there's this thing in me that says, like, then there's the positive form of this is this attitude that we're not going to get hung up on things that happened in the past. We're not going to get, maybe you went through some adverse circumstances, but you can't go back and change it. You just have to, like, meet the situation in your life bravely and confidently, and not get hung up on all this. But there's a certain thing that's like, it kind of feels like this attitude saying that, like, you're not allowed to complain about anything. No, not even that. It's like this idea that, like, if you try to talk about your adverse circumstances or the things you went through that were difficult, you're playing the victim, right? Like, you are. Rather than taking responsibility for your own life, you are blaming some system or some structure for. But, like, man, this kind of thing. It's like I was writing about this in the journal about this during this Truth and Reconciliation Day, and the whole thing is that there seems to be this attitude of, like, I'm just gonna, like, to be upfront about it, growing up here in Canada, in British Columbia, I have to admit there is a lot of racism and against the Indigenous, the Native people. This whole, the negative stereotype of, like, the drunken Indian and stuff like that, right? And there's a certain kind of, like, it's like, there's this, I guess you could call it, like, victim blaming or something like that, right? There's a certain kind of, like, there's a certain attitude that if you are, like, a well-to-do, working, employed person who's doing good in life, and you see some drunk person on the street, there's something about, like, there's a certain, it feels like there's this collective attitude that's like, we don't owe any sympathy to these people, you know. Maybe something happened. Maybe these people got abused, or maybe some sort of they encountered some problem. But you know, they're just playing the victim. They just want a free pass. They want handouts from the government. They want us to, you know, like, what do you want us to do? Cry about it? You know, like, I mean, this is like, it's like I'm just trying to say, I feel like there's this under this sort of like oppressive. There's something inside of me that is like. That it's like a drill sergeant being like, you can't play the victim. You can't just blame your problems on somebody else, on some kind of a system. You can't question the psychiatry system. You can't question the colonial system. It's all in the past. There's nothing you can do about it. All you can do is just have a positive attitude and try to, like, you know, apply yourself to life and make good or whatever, right? And if you try to point out that there's maybe some problem, you're just playing the victim. You're just like, but there's some other, what I'm trying to say is that there's some kind of like, I started reading a new book. I finished a book and I started reading a book. I'm not going to get into the details now, but I came across this like phrase that's like casting your own shadow, right? And there's something about the, this whole process of like what's conscious and what's unconscious, right? What's out in the open, what's not out in the open. With the indigenous people, like, I'm a millennial. I went to school and they taught us Canadian history and stuff like that. There's a lot of stuff that would be considered like the bad stuff that happened to indigenous people that wasn't really part of the curriculum. Right? And I think we're part of the thing about the truth and reconciliation thing is to somehow establish some kind of historical fact and incorporate that into the story that we tell. So it's not just something that's happening under the surface in the shadows, like this big pool of water that's piling. And then so you have all these people who are like, you know, and then we blame the people who are like self-medicating. You've got all these people that you're like, you know, you've got a drunk Indian, you've got an addict on the street, and we don't want to listen to them. We just say, don't blame some other person. Take responsibility for yourself. We don't want to listen. You know what I mean? It's like, it's crazy. Like, it's like, there's some kind of like, there's something that Slavoj Žižek said. I mean, Žižek tends to repeat this point quite a lot, but he was basically saying that, like, if we're doing this project of kind of admitting the problems of colonialism and all this kind of stuff, we also have to be careful not to if we make the people into just innocent victims, then what this is doing is it's sort of like denying all the reality that they may also have their own shadow, right? And this is what's resonating for me around this whole, you know, the astrology right now with all this water stuff, with Venus and Scorpio, with Libra and the blind spot of Scorpio, all that, right? There's this whole thing about like Zizek uses this example, like there's often seen as a huge source of guilt, particularly for like the British colonialists, this whole thing about black slavery and white supremacy and all this kind of stuff. But he's saying that the truth is more complicated because in Africa there were Africans who conquered other tribes and sold the conquered people as slaves, right? That there were like the Africans themselves were involved in the capture and sale of slaves, and it wasn't just a white man's problem, right? And that there's this whole, and Slavoj Žižek tries to make this point that like we don't want to just if we're granting the other, if we're getting away from this thing that's like white supremacy, where the white people are in some privileged position to the other people, right? By being at the level of equals is like you're granting the other people the right or the ability to have their own shadow. And that to the extent that you're not doing that, these people are just in your shadow, right? If we are in the idea that this is a colonial country, and God save the Queen and all that kind of stuff, that if we don't grant the indigenous people or even the immigrants their same level of autonomy and agency as the white Canadian majority, then effectively these people are in the shadow of the white majority, right? But there's something about the whole thing about being in the shadow of the white majority is that it's precisely because people are in the shadow of the majority that shadowy shit happens to them, right? That this whole thing is that because a lot of this has to do with controversies around residential schools that the Catholic Church was involved in, and the abuses of the Catholic Church, which, I mean, it's not even just limited to that. Like, there's all sorts of problems with the Catholic Church, and whether that's sex abuse or whether that's, you name it, right? And it's precisely because the pretense of being the church that's there for the good, that's there to uphold all the principles and the moral standards and stuff. Because when you position yourself in that thing where our whole job is to be a kind of a moral authority, then it's in the shadow of that light that all this shitty bad stuff happens, right? And so you have to, in order to not have, but by letting these people out of the shadow, first of all, that means giving them the ability to tell their story about what happened to them, right? And then once these people are individuated or freed from that shadow, then they have the opportunity to have their own shadow, being that nobody's perfect. Right? That you can't just, and this is the whole thing. I think that this is there's something that's coming out of all this for me, that it's not just about either playing the victim or victim blaming or anything like that, but it's that if, another example is the whole, there's all the scandals going on with P. Diddy and all this kind of stuff, which it seems to me that I got the news earlier. I sort of mentioned something about it, right? But it seems to me that this is starting to ripple out into the common awareness a bit more, right? And there's certain things that Diddy was a guy who was in the spotlight. It feels really weird to be a millennial kid growing up and just being you're watching MTV, you're Much Music, or here in Canada, and you're getting all this how many you're just you're a kid who's going through puberty, trying to understand how the world works, and your media stream is all P. Diddy and R. Kelly and all these even Canadian, these Canadian rock bands that are getting exposed as sex abusers and stuff. It's sort of we're young impressionable teen. I mean, I start to sound maybe a conservative Christian or something like that if I go too far. But this is it's just weird, right? I mean, this is the world we live in, right? We live in a world where there's all this stuff that's just in the spotlight, and then obviously all this awful shit going on in the shadows of that spotlight, right? And so what happens is that, to the extent that that's the arrangement, that you have to, now we're having this thing where the stuff is emerging out of the shadows, and you have a chance to find out about it, to talk about it and stuff like that, right? But there's some kind of there's some kind of thing the whole dialogue around either victim blaming or playing the victim or stuff like that. If you were I mean, it's kind of an extreme example, but if you were literally sex trafficked or something like that, or captured and forced into labor or something it's Yeah, you're and kept secret. You're fucking in the fucking dark dungeon of some fucking famous rich person who wants to keep that secret, who wants to keep you in their shadow, right? And then when you get freed out of that shadow, you may find, the victim may find that they have their own perpetrator in them, that they're not just entirely 100% an innocent victim. They have their own problems, or they have their own capacity to do bad things or something like that. They have both good and bad inside them. But if they're just fucking hiding in the dungeon, if these people are secretly hiding in the dungeon, or secretly being, obscured by the shadow of some rich person who wants to keep it secret, or in the shadow of some power structure that claims moral authority. We're the church, we're the Catholic Church, we do everything right, and don't look at all this other bad stuff we've done wrong, right? Like, there's this sort of it's like you need to give this stuff a chance to come to light, and then afterwards we can say, yeah, once we all have an equal share of the light, then we also have the ability, we're all casting our own light and casting our own shadow, and that nobody is perfect, nobody is nobody is entirely just all bad, right? Or I'd hope not, at least, right? I don't know. This feels a bit messy, but I'm trying to communicate the idea. I don't know. Maybe I should oh boy, my style has been just to not to edit these videos and just try to get it out there. But it feels, I don't know. It's imperfect. I'm going to try to go for it, though. I feel like I'm getting my idea across. But this is, the whole thing is that, I feel like there's a problem indicative to my own channel being that I have some sort of desire to either talk about something, write about something, or I have all these books that I'm reading, and the books fill this kind of void for me, because there's a void because there's certain conversations or certain topics that I just can't get into with people, right? And that it's it's a relief to find that you're you can go to the bookstore, you find all this reading material, and you're kind of oh, all this stuff which I would consider some off limits thing that I can't talk about, there's tons of books about it. There's tons of people writing about it. I could get really into this stuff, and I could write my own book about it if I wanted to, right? But the thing about this is it seems in the creative process of trying to have this conversation, I'm basically I'm imagining my audience as being the person who I can't talk to about this, or whether I'm doing that deliberately or not. It's it's an influence, right? I'm imagining that there's all this stuff that normally I can't talk about it in day-to-day conversation, but I have this opportunity with the medium of YouTube or the medium of the internet to write about whatever I want to write about, or talk about whatever I want to talk about. But the thing is, I'm still, my lived experience is of feeling like I'm in the shadow, right? Feeling or that this idea that you're by being, there's some kind of misunderstanding, right? And this is why, I'm not going to make there's another video that I recorded recently that I decided not to post, that I didn't think was very good. And I think the main thing was that it was astrology has its own shadow, right? Regardless of whatever I'm doing with astrology, astrology as a practice has its own shadow. And if I choose to focus my creative efforts on this project, doing an astrology channel, I'm just caught in the shadow of astrology, right? And that could be, obvious things, people who don't believe it, right? People who think you're a charlatan, right? People who think you're just making stuff up. People who think that you're just a grifter, avoiding a decent, hardworking job, and you're just trying to scam people by making up a bunch of bullshit or something, right? That's an obvious one, right? there could also be this whole thing about like people who, you know, like I got into this conversation. I was talking like there's this people who criticize astrology and astrologers due to like the implication of discrimination, and the example being like if you were to, you know, be interviewing roommates and you have a bunch of roommates, but you're like, oh well, you know, sorry, but you know, in my chart, I've got certain aspects that means that I probably wouldn't get along with you if you are like a Libra or a Capricorn, and I see that you have a lot of those placements, so you don't get, so like people feel like you're unfairly discriminating against people if you were to do something like that, to use astrology as a reason not to have somebody as a roommate or not to hire them or whatever, right? And it's sort of like, there's a lot to unpack there, but this is one of the things that it's like, I feel like I kept getting sucked into this trap of like what I'm creating is basically it's like catering to the shadow of the thing that I'm doing, right? There's like all these problems that are inherent to the shadow of an astrology but the thing, the nature of that problem is like people who are like, well, I don't like astrology because this, that, and the other thing, and these people are probably not going to listen to the channel in the first place, right? And it creates this feeling of like, feeling like all these people who don't like astrology and being like, I've got the perfect defense for them. And I think it's also like in the sense of like by actually recording it and then watching it and like paying attention not just to what I'm saying at a literal rational level, but the emotion behind it. Like sometimes there's a video that I recorded and I decided not to do because I didn't let the register of my voice, right? What I'm doing with my voice, the vocal register I'm hitting, it's like regardless of what actual content that I'm trying to say, I'm like, why is my voice hanging out in this specific, like I'm probably doing it right now to some extent, right? I'm probably doing it right now, but there's like, why am I hanging out in this specific zone and catering to that subjectivity that's in that zone and I feel like I'm wasting all this creative energy, this creative potential on being reactive, right? Or being defensive, right? Being that there's obvious, it's like, and it could be any number of things. It could be astrology because astrology has its own shadow. It could be if I'm into philosophy, if I'm reading Friedrich Nietzsche or Heidegger or something like that, I can sense that there's a shadow, like any project that any other person is doing, like all sorts of the history of philosophy of all these different things, they have their own shadows, and that the thing is, there's so many people that will just be like, yeah, I don't go for this stuff because I don't like Nietzsche because he was a misogynist, because the Nazis used his ideas, because you know, he was anti-Christian or what, you know, for whatever. And it's sort of like these people are just going to use these reasons to dismiss you and not pay attention to you. And then the more you're catering to that shadow, it's like this whole thing about Nietzsche being like the guy who is like, oh, I sense you don't want to hear what I have to say. Well, I'm just gonna chase after you, yell. There's also this thing that apparently like I was watching this there's this podcast about Nietzsche and Van Gogh, and apparently Van Gogh would be the kind of person that like if he got into an argument with his friend, and his friend's like, I don't want to talk about this, I'm going to sleep. And like Van Gogh went into the friend's bedroom and like pulled up a chair with his friend in bed trying to sleep, and like, I'm gonna, you know, like, I'm not gonna let you just go to sleep. I'm gonna, you know, you're gonna listen to me. You're not getting my point. I'm gonna communicate to you. And it's just like, oh my God, like this is like, it's like being just overwhelmed by this like that kind of energy is like messing up my whole creative process. And it would be, you know, like, and this is the thing. I don't know. I'm like, I one of the things that's been coming up for me around this whole eclipse is that I have to admit that there are certain goals or aims that I may have had with what I'm doing with this project on YouTube. And I have, at some point in time, at some point I have to admit that I'm not getting what I want out of this, right? Like, I have to just very straight up just say that, like, I've been doing this channel for a number of years now, and I would have hoped that by creating this content, or by whatever it is, wherever my creative process is going, whether that's making vlogs or whether that's writing something, that this would attract somebody who finds what I'm saying interesting, and that would spark some kind of, I mean, I get a little bit of engagement. I'm not saying I'm not getting any interaction or engagement, and I have been getting some viewers who understand where I'm going with this Nietzsche stuff, and I don't have to play, so giving the sense I don't have to play defense all the time. This is the problem, that it's like, instead of communicating to the people who understand and who are listening, it feels like I'm caught in this pattern of having to defend myself against people who probably don't want to listen in the first place. And the whole question is like, and then this is like, it's like getting in, like, it's like trying to like shadow box with somebody who doesn't want to fight you, right? It's like, but you're like, because like, if you had an open actual engagement, then you could have a discussion, you could have a talk, you could have a conversation, but nobody wants to talk about anything anymore. Like, I think this happened, you know, I don't know if this happened like after Donald Trump got popular or whatever, but there's this kind of thing where it's like nobody really believes in having an open conversation about anything anymore, right? Nobody believes in making a rational argument for anything. It's all just like, you know, just saying these highly charged, manipulative things that are like, you know, and to me, it feels like it's like, feels like always being bullied or coerced or like pushed to do something, and it's like, when you want to talk about this? No, we're just gonna fucking intimidate you. We're just gonna like make you feel, and it's not even just like people, but it's like the fucking structure of YouTube, the algorithm, right? Like, I'm like, look, I'm somebody who has mental health problems. I'm open about that. And I'm just gonna give you an example. Like, I don't think the algorithm is very good. I had at some point in time, I'm just using Facebook, and the YouTube algorithm recommends me a song that's called "Kill Yourself," right? And I listened to the song. The song was I think it was like kind of like a joke song from the 1970s, because it was all very like, you know, like hippie folk music. It sounded all nice, but and it was actually a criticism of pollution. People who pollute the earth with factories and cars and too much air pollution, and you know that you're killing the environment, so go kill yourself, right? But if you don't listen to the song, it's just like the algorithm looks like it's telling you to kill yourself, right? Another thing that YouTube algorithm does, the YouTube algorithm gave me another video that says, from a band called "We Hate You, Please Die," right? And it's sort of like this thing of like, rather than having like an engagement with real people and talking to them, I've got an AI that's like, oh, here's a mentally ill guy who's had a history with different struggles, and we're just going to feed him content that tries to trigger his weaknesses, tries to manipulate the things he's insecure about. And it's like, you know, why the fuck am I even doing this? Like, why, you know, there's no rational in discourse. There's no opportunity to like take what's lurking in the shadow and talk about it and have an open dialogue, a meaningful. It's all just a bunch of fucking like, you know, like people manipulating your wounds, your insecurities, your weaknesses, trying to be pushed in one direction or another. And the thing is, it's like, but like the more you're conscious of that's going on, you can see it. You can see it for what it is, right? But it's like it feels like, you know, like the situation is just inherently toxic, right? And I don't, you know, sometimes I wonder if trying to do this YouTube channel is even helpful in the first place, right? And like, this is the whole thing, is like, I'd hope, I don't know. Well, okay, it's almost an hour now. I think I've communicated what I'm trying to say. Thanks for watching, anyways. Thanks for my new subscribers. I noticed I picked up a couple new subscribers since the last video. All right, have a good one, and hope y'all are holding up well. I'll catch you next time. Thanks for watching.